Welcome to Writer, a program for and about writers sponsored by Florida Community College at Jacksonville. I'm Frank Green, your host, and with me today is James Hall, author of Under Cover of Daylight, Tropical Freeze, Bones of Coral, Hard Aground, Mean High Tide, Gone Wild, Paper Products, a collection of short stories, and 4 books of poetry. Welcome, Mr. Hall. Glad to have you here today.
Great to be here.
How did you begin your writing career, or how did you gain your interest in being a writer in today's society that views oftentimes reading and writing as not really doing something?
Well, I can trace it back, way far back, to early years when I was growing up in Kentucky, hearing a lot of good stories around me all the time and being interested in good stories. And the next shaping impact, I suppose, was discovering books and finding that books were a way to pull myself away from the confusing things of the world, and I could retreat to my bedroom and get involved in a story. And it's a natural progression, I think, after you've fallen in love with books for one reason or another, to want to be a part of that whole world in some way or another too. But the shaping, the most important, I think, the most important event really was when I went away to college. I had dabbled with writing in high school, written some poems and a few things for the newspaper. But I honestly, growing up in the 50s in a little town in Kentucky where most of the writers I read in high school had been dead for 100 years, I truly believed that writing was something that had died out, that it just wasn't going on anymore, you know, that the little poems that I was writing may have made me the only living writer. That's how out of touch I was with reality. So when I went away to college, all of that changed radically, and I met a poet who was a faculty member at the college where I went to in Florida, Peter Meinke, a wonderful poet who has become a wonderful short story writer as well. And the scales fell from my eyes, and I thought, there's more to life than either being a football coach or a businessman, which were the only 2 models of male employment that I had seen in the world until that time, and suddenly this whole possibility opened up to me.
That reading as a child really probably opened you up to an understanding of humanity and of our humanness, and an understanding of life that was a wonderful supplement to your formal education, I would imagine.
Well, I think it did help a great deal, yes. As I say, a small town in Kentucky in the 50s, it's a very confined and limited social landscape. And reading, I didn't really know this at the time, but when I was reading, I was exploring the world beyond the city limits in a way that I was not privileged to do or able to do any other way. And yes, that was wonderful. I think more than that, though, psychologically for me, the hook reading always was that it was a kind of sinful recreation that I saw as great pleasure and great fun, but that people in the schools and my parents saw as actually a socially respectable activity. I knew that when I was going into these books, I was having all these wonderful, almost voyeuristic experiences, getting privileged glimpses into the human heart, as Fitzgerald said in The Great Gatsby, these images of a life that I would never be able to see otherwise. And yet I got a lot of mileage out of reading books. People actually thought I was a serious student, when in fact I was just having a good time.
That's great. Well, now you continue in a slightly different strain on the other end by way of teaching too, don't you?
Well, yeah, I think it was just a natural thing of falling in love with school, basically. And I went through college and graduate school and got my PhD. And if there had been degrees beyond a PhD, I would have gotten them too, because I just wanted to stay in school as long as possible. And when they finally kicked me out of graduate school, having gotten whatever degrees were available, there was the only alternative I could see in the world was to try to go back to teaching somewhere so I could still be on that academic cycle and be around books and around people who were having interesting conversations about things.
Was English your undergraduate major?
I was an English major. I think it was called literature at
Right.
my school, but then my master's degree was in creative writing, and then my PhD was in literature with a creative writing dissertation. There are a lot of those schools out there these days. Now, when I was in school, in graduate school, there were only a handful. There's Iowa and Utah and Stanford and a few others. Now, almost every state has 2 or 3 Master of Fine Arts programs or some kind of creative writing program within the state university system, which makes it affordable for a lot of students all over the place. And I think there's a kind of reaction that some writers have to a formal education, going to school as though somehow they're going to become like everybody else because they go to school, or they're going to write like everybody else. And there is a little danger of that, I think, that anybody who wants to be a writer should be on guard against being molded too much by the colleges or universities. But I'm a real believer that colleges and universities can foster good writing in the way that a greenhouse produces plants. It's a protective environment. It speeds up the process. It gets you over some things that you might have taken years to learn on your own out there outside of the halls of academe. And while there are some pitfalls and dangers, I think overall it's a very good way for a writer to be trained in the world today.
Well, beginning in your undergraduate education, it seems as though you've kind of gravitated, as writers often do, to other writers like Sterling Watson and Peter Meinke, and had a sense of community, of purpose in writing fiction very early on.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's true. I do. A lot of the people that who are my friends now, I have a lot of writer friends now, partly because this strange activity you do, you can talk about with them and share the things that you care about with them. But I have a lot of friends who are non-writers too, and I think that's a crucial factor. They're readers. Most of my friends are readers, and that's an important feature in friendship for me, that they actually care about books. But I think it's very important that you. I have difficulty sometimes being around writers because we seem to be vying for material. You know, somebody says something interesting, and everybody sort of reaches for their notebook to write it down. And I think, no, wait a minute. I heard that first. That's mine. So you gotta be aware of being around writers too much.
I think it would be difficult to vie with you. You've already taken all the good titles, it sounds to me. With
No.
Mean High Tide and Hard to Ground and Tropical Freeze and Bones of Coral and Undercover of Daylight. They're just fabulous titles.
Well, thanks.
Very memorable and solid stories behind them. You've had some very good success with the creative writing program that you conduct too,
Right.
haven't you? Produced some writers.
Yeah, we've
drawn some writing out of people.
I think it's a little bit of both. I think what happens with a writing program, now that I see it from this perspective, is that what you most want to do is not mess somebody up. That somebody that's obviously got some drive and energy and talent when they arrive in your program, you're doing everything you can to encourage them and to help them learn and build their careers. But at the same time, you don't want to overmanage them either, because a good writer will find their own way. You want to just continue to give them the sunlight and the other things that they need to flourish. What we have had at where I teach it in Miami, some very good results in the last few years. Some good students. A woman named Barbara Parker, who's published her first couple of novels now, thrillers set in Florida, Suspicion of Innocence and Suspicion of Guilt, and a young man named Dennis Lehane, who's published a book with Harcourt Brace called A Drink Before the War. And we have a woman publishing a book this summer that's just gotten a huge advance, so big apparently that she's been sworn to secrecy, not able to say exactly how much she
Well, that's
got.
thrilling for you.
Oh,
isn't
it is. It's
Just-
been a very, very exciting, and I can't be more happy. I don't
Right.
I don't see myself as creating my own competition
No.
at all, but creating more people who do a very good and important thing.
Contributing to the tradition of fine writing, and that's almost as what you're doing in that regard is probably almost as satisfying as writing your own books.
It is in some ways, yes, absolutely. I think we've talked around this a little bit, but I think this is one of the areas, writing, like some of the other arts, that really almost requires a mentor, requires someone who you fasten onto either personally or their work, so that you measure your own progress and your own values, and your work is shaped by its reference to this other person's who is more advanced and more skilled than you are, their life, their work, how they operate, and so on.
A mentor like that, it seems to me, can reveal matters of the craft of writing and the craft of writing fiction in particular that otherwise might take many, many years for the writer to discover on his or her own.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about your own writing and how you work. I'm mindful, for instance, of something like what are some of the daily dilemmas that you face in your writing?
Well, sometimes people ask me about discipline. How are you disciplined? How do you keep yourself there at the table working away? And my discipline really never enters into it. The discipline, the only way that discipline enters into it is a way that is sort of unexpected when someone asks the question of this, which is that I have to discipline myself to push myself away from the desk. It's an activity that I love so much, that I enjoy so much, and I find so fulfilling in the doing of it that I have to remind myself that it's important for me to also do the other things that I enjoy in life, go fishing, or spend time with my friends, my wife, my animals, walk around my yard, have the rest of a real life. In a way, that's a wonderful dilemma to have, that you love what you do so much that it becomes almost a compulsion to do it.
Well, this is Joseph Campbell's idea of seeking your bliss.
Exactly.
And
I would say
finding productive work in what you love
or
to do.
self-actualizing activity,
Yes.
whatever name you give it, bliss is the best as far as I'm concerned. But it's not everyday blissful. By no means is it
And
blissful.
the bliss is not any hedonistic kind of thing
No.
that is strictly hedonistic.
It gives you sustenance and it nourishes your soul in a way. But I would suggest to beginning writers or writers who are trying to find their way through all of this that that Joseph Campbell notion of following your bliss can be important in a kind of subtle and in terms of changing your direction here or there. I've made some major changes of direction as a writer over the years, and those have been very, very important in terms of getting me back onto the bliss direction. For instance, I wrote poetry for many years. I published these 4 books of poems, and then what I thought I wanted to do was write novels which were serious literary novels that I would get respect for from my colleagues at the university. And what I eventually found was that after failing at 4 of those novels, I wrote 4 of those novels, none of them were published, and never will be, no matter what happens to my career, that the books that I was reading on the weekends, the Elmore Leonards, Raymond Chandler, and Dashiell Hammett, and John D. MacDonald, and those books that I read for fun and pleasure, were really the books that I wanted to write like. I thought, well, I'll take a shot at one of these books because I'm clearly not smart enough to write a really great book, so I'm going to write one of these sort of thriller novels. And when I found that, it was like finding the mother lode, the touchstone, the thing that I'd been looking for, because there was a book that I could do all the things I wanted to do with poetry. I could do all the things that I was trying to do with a serious novel, and then something else that I had been missing all along that kept me thrilled and excited through the whole process.
But those kinds of books are serious works. They're great literature in their own right because you've got characters who are wrestling with problems of their heart that are problems in varying ways that the reader has.
Well, now I think that. I truly
Yes.
believe that's true, and I'm glad you feel that way as well. That's not generally the traditional way of looking at mysteries and thrillers. The traditional way has always been in the academic world to see them as a subgenre that's less important and less capable of...
But you and Raymond Chandler and Elmore Leonard are showing the public and academia itself, I think, that though that may not be the tradition per se, it's going to be the tradition here pretty soon.
Well, it's becoming that way. There are more and more good writers like James Lee Burke, for instance, and Walter Mosley have gravitated towards this the genre in the last 5 to 10 years, and I think it's been enriched enormously of what it's capable of doing.
Well, the exploration of your characters in your story is as much a process of discovery as it is any kind of planning, or more discovery than it is planning.
That's
I would
absolutely
guess.
true. For me, it is.
Right.
There's now writers work different ways, and I don't think there's. I think it's important to say that there is not one way that is the correct way of designing your book or your story, whatever it may be. My particular way has to do with discovery. That the image that I keep in mind is one that Robert Frost said about poems, that good poems were like ice cubes on a griddle. They rode on their own undoing. They were lubricated and moved freely by their own dissolving in a way that's about... He also said another wonderful line, no thrill for the writer, no thrill for the reader. If you're not excited when you're writing about what you're writing, it's almost a guarantee that your reader's not going to be excited. Unfortunately, the corollary is not also true. If you are excited, it doesn't automatically mean that your reader is going to be excited. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. But you can be sure that if you're bored with what you're writing, that your reader is going to be bored with what you're writing as well. Yeah, discovery is at the key of what I do. I don't have a roadmap when I begin. I don't have an outline. I don't know where I'm going. I have a general subject matter that I've done some research on, usually with the novel before I begin, a month or so of research, collected a lot of data and information. And then I do a lot of pre-writing, what I would call pre-writing activities, writing conversations, dialogue between two people. I don't even know who these two people are. I just am trying to hear some interesting voices, something that would probably get you thrown into a mental institution in the regular world. You're trying to cause yourself to hear voices and then to record what they say and continue to have them speak. When I hear them, when I hear the voices, and there's enough of them that are interesting and unique from one another, I say, okay, I think I got the people. I know I got my general subject over here. Let's see what's going to happen. And I set off on this journey that takes about a year to get to the end of.
Well, a writer without a good ear is a sad writer and an unsuccessful writer, almost always, I would think. I mean, an actual ear and the imaginative ear, too. I think of writers like Eudora Welty, whose dialogue reflects that she really knows how to listen, has a wonderful ear. And you mentioned that the matter of subject and content in your work. I know you have some ecological things from time to time. How do you select those, and what's the role of that kind of content in your work?
Well, I think it's important for me, and I think it should be important for most writers to have an ongoing, ask that question in an ongoing way, constantly. What are my major concerns? What are my major themes, subjects, and so on? What are the things that I care about in the world? I think when I first started writing novels, I just thought what you did was you told an interesting story and you got from page 1 to the end, and that was all you really had to do. And that was a misunderstanding in a way, because novels are really about something. They're not just interesting stories. They're also about something you're wrestling with in the world, not something you've already made your mind up about. Usually, that's not, I don't think, a profitable area to write about, because then what you're really writing is a form of subtle propaganda. You're just taking a position on a particular issue and arguing for that case, and that's unlikely to produce discoveries on your part. You're just going to say what you already know about something. So I try to take on issues that, to me, are unresolved in my mind. So insofar as I do write about Florida and about the ecological concerns of Florida, it's true that I do have a position. I love Florida. I love the land. I love the weather, the environment, the smell of the air, and the feel of the cinnamon-laden breezes and everything. You name it. I love it about Florida. And I regret seeing the dissolution and the destruction of Florida in lots of ways with development and so on. And yet, I also see, I'm torn. I'm, as they say these days, conflicted about this issue. I hate that terminology, but I am
Okay.
I'm at odds over certain aspects of this. And in each new subject, for instance, one of my novels, Gone Wild, is involved with animal poaching in Florida and around the world.
Right.
And on the one hand, what used to be called hunting to people who were in Florida early on and who were trappers and hunters and were trying to survive on the land, now the very same thing that they do, or they've always done all their lives, now what that thing is illegal, because the environment is more pressured, and these animals are, some of the animals they're hunting are now endangered. So that the land that they used to hunt is now restricted, and what they have always done freely and naturally all their lives, they can no longer do. I find that very sad and very unfortunate, and I'm sympathetic towards those people. But I still, nevertheless, have to struggle with that issue, because the whole idea of killing animals for any purpose bothers me a little bit. So I need to find issues personally that I can see various sides of, and I've at least got two opposing views of on the same issue. To me, that's very important.
Well, talking about killing animals, a good many of your people die in your stories, but you bring them alive before you kill them. And
well, that's important. That is important. You're in danger if you're in one of my books, and you're in danger if you're a friend of Thorn's, one of my characters that's run through several of the books. Yeah, my attitude about mysteries and thrillers is that if there's not some emotional cost involved in the death of one of the characters in the book, then why should we as a reader care about the solution to the murder or the crime that's been perpetrated against this individual? The alternate model is the British mystery, in which the traditional Agatha Christie type murder, in which there's a body on the rug at the beginning of the book, and we, the reader, know little or nothing about this person, have no emotional investment in their death. The whole story proceeds as though there's some kind of mess on the rug that we have to first clean up, and then we find out who put the mess there. And it's all very rational and intellectual, but it's not very emotionally charged. And it's very important for me in my work to have there be a moral and emotional charge when someone dies.
well, I'm reminded of Faulkner. I believe he said that the great stories are the stories of the human heart in conflict with itself. And I'm very conscious of the resolutions in your stories, consisting of not only the protagonist working out in very realistic actions the dilemma that the protagonist has been presented with, but also there is a real epiphany, an expansion of consciousness, if you will, an understanding that the protagonist comes with through what he has undergone, and matters of redemption in literature.
Well, I think that's a good point, and it's important, it seems to me, that writers realize that, and readers as well, realize that what stories are really about is transformation in some form. And back to Joseph Campbell, in a way, every quest is a quest about transformation. Every quest is a quest. Every holy grail that any hero goes out to seek is a holy grail that ought to change them in some way if they acquire this, or if they do what they set out to do. And that's it. The simple way of putting it is no change on the character, there's no story. If the character doesn't change, there is no story. That's, whether you put it in religious terms or psychological terms, it must be there.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Hall. This has been Writer to Writer, sponsored by Florida Community College at Jacksonville with Mr. James Hall. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank.